If you've ever wanted to dive into a graphic novel and learn all of the stories that inspired it and that went into making it, then you're in the right place. Because this is the second in a series of videos where we dive into our graphic novel, Incredible Doom Volume 1. It's a book from Harper Alley about a group of teenagers in the mid-90s that get their lives just turned upside down by the arrival of the early internet. My name is Matthew Bogart.
And I'm Jesse Holden.
And let's get into it. We're going to start with the third chapter, or what was originally the third mini-comic. Originally, we had planned on having Allison and Samir run away from home together in the first chapter. But we decided when we started writing it that we really needed to spend some time getting to know Allison before we set her off on this adventure. So we made the first issue primarily about Allison, and then we saw Samir just briefly get introduced at the very end of the first issue. So then we told a story about Richard, and when we came back to these two, we thought, great, now we're finally ready to get them on the road. We thought page 1, panel 1, they're on the road running away from home together. Until we realized we really needed to spend some time getting to know Samir. So part 3 became about Samir. Samir references the fact that Allison and he have met before. They snuck out and met at a Denny's. This was actually depicted in a short comic that I did just for patrons. Allison comes over to the house. We see her look at some photographs. 2 of the photographs are actually patrons that subscribed at a tier to get themselves drawn into the comics. You can notice those people throughout the entire book.
You didn't know that you were buying a Where's Waldo book, but you were.
Samir recaps some of the things that have been going on with them, and they decide to play Commander Keen, which is a real game series of side-scrolling platform games by ID Software or id Software. It was my favorite piece of shareware back in the day because I was amazed that shareware meant it was free on purpose. Now you can play it for free on the Internet Archive, and it does in fact include Pepsi cans. Allison discovers a note that Samir has crumpled up in the trash can, and this note is pulled from real life.
How much should I admit to here? The first time I called a girl on the phone to try to ask her out on a date, I was so nervous. And so in advance, I thought through how the conversation might go, and I drew a little flowchart so I would always know what to say. Like many devastatingly awkward things from my childhood, I shared it with Matt, and he decided to capitalize on it for the book.
If it's devastatingly awkward, it's going in Incredible Doom. This note was actually the FEELIE for this issue. We made a little tiny version of it to put in the back of the third issue of the series. There's other cool stuff in this intro of Samir as well. When he's picking up comics off of his floor, it includes the cover of a comic that my friend Joe Besh drew when we were in middle school. Joe later went on to help me draw Incredible Doom Volume 2. Sam also puts a NASA baseball cap away on its shelf, which is a reference to his mom, who works for NASA. It's not explicitly said here, but it is said in a couple other places, including a 20-page backup story that we drew exclusively for patrons. And I did put in the work to contact people who are familiar with NASA or who worked at NASA and figure out what might someone who matches the description of this character been doing at NASA at this time in the 90s. All so we could accurately place this baseball cap. So Allison shows Samir a retention of vision vanish, which is a trick that I know how to do. Is you take a quarter, and then you put it into the palm of your hand, right in the middle of the palm of your hand, right there. It's got to be in the middle because that's where the most amount of heat gets to it. If you squeeze it really tight, the heat then causes the quarter to just evaporate. So Allison and Samir go in the backyard. They're talking about running away from home until Allison reveals that she's living in a pretty crummy situation.
It can be a pretty human experience, especially at this age, that you don't have a lot of context for what's normal and what's not. And sometimes you would come to this discovery that something was really unusual or really not okay just because you shared it with somebody and they responded that way.
So let's talk about Chapter 4. And if we're going to talk about Chapter 4, we have to talk about Chapter 5 at the same time, because originally, when we were drawing the mini-comics, everything that happened in Chapter 4 and 5 was going to be all squeezed into just Chapter 4, but we couldn't do it in one issue. We had to break it up into two. In these issues, we focus a lot on graffiti.
Evol House and Chaos have kind of a distinct graffiti style of the era. I was lucky enough to be close friends with a guy who I guess I would call a graffiti enthusiast, has an encyclopedic knowledge of graffiti history, especially around our part of the country. And I tapped him to help design what a tag from this scene, from this era, would look like.
Tina asks Richard what kind of music he's into, and he says he doesn't know. Tom Lehrer. Tom Lehrer was a musician from the 50s and 60s that wrote comedy music. I redrew page 133 3 times. I redrew it twice before it saw print in the original mini-comic, and then our editors requested that I redraw it a 3rd time so that we could see Evol House in the same shot for the collection. Tina gives Richard a cassette by The Disappointments. In the late 90s, I got my first ever paid artistic job when a local punk band hired me to draw the cover of a 45 they had coming out. And with the permission, I used a recreation of that artwork in the comic. And then we've got a bunch of little odds and ends. Well, there's a call out where Gerbil mentions that there's broken glass in the bathroom, and then later in issue 5, you see him picking broken glass out of the sole of his shoe.
Yes, Zippy Search is a third-party thing that they would have had to patch in.
The book that Tina is reading in the basement is Stephen King's The Dawning of the Three. And there's a panel towards the end of the book where we see a bunch of kids waiting at a bus stop. These are all patrons. Moving on to Chapter 5. One of the patrons who was offering to be drawn into the comic, or paying to be drawn into the comic, was a friend of mine named Brian. I was asking him for photo reference of himself when he was a teenager. And he sent me this photo, which I blurred out everyone's faces, of him and his friends, and I thought there was something great about this, so I used it as inspiration for the first drawing in this chapter. I used a movie from the late 80s called River's Edge for inspiration for some of the other character designs in the book. And then Richard gets this idea from a BBS post about how he's going to get Tina out of jail. This was based a little bit on real life.
A friend of mine was arrested on suspicion of vandalism, and so I won't go into too much detail, but the idea was floated. If his tag started appearing in some high-profile places around our small town while he was in jail, sure, couldn't his lawyer use that to prove that it couldn't be him?
Richard puts up a tag towards the end of the issue where he identifies his crew as the Free BBS Boys, which, if you didn't catch it, is a reference to the BBS that he shares with his friends back home. The scenes where Richard is actually doing his tagging, I set in Mansfield, Ohio, the place where I grew up. I used Google Street View to find a few streets that I like the look of as inspiration. It's actually just a few blocks away from where they filmed this scene in The Shawshank Redemption. So now we've covered issues 1 through 5, chapters 1 through 5 of the collection. And we're at the last chapter of Volume 1, the last issue of the comic series. This is the issue where everything fell apart, where we very nearly needed to cancel the entire comic series, where everything went wrong. So that story, we're going to make its own video. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this kind of stuff, I've been making this kind of thing for years on my Patreon and at my blog at matthewbogart.net. And if you think you know anybody else that might like this, it would mean a lot if you let them know. Thanks.